I'm going to be breaking down the strongest mid laners for carrying solo queue here in patch 10.24. Do keep in mind that you can carry and improve with any one of these champions. So if I do put your favorite champions in a low tier, don't get mad. You can still improve and climb as is. Also, depending on your elo, some of these champions may be one tier higher or even one tier lower, since player skill does play a part in this. Starting at the list strong, we have Taliyah and the bottom of F tier. She's not really played at all anymore. In general, she's not viable in any role. She doesn't have much wave clear, and she has a lot of counterplay with how easy her knockup is to dodge. Ahead of her, we have Irelia. The new item changes haven't been very kind to her, plus with how strong some of the mages are in the top tier, it's very difficult for her to perform. A lot of champions in F tier are going to be semi-controversial, so please just bear with me. Next up, we have Yone. He struggles really hard against a lot of the top tiers. There are plenty of champions kind of E through B that he can play against, but in general, the F tier, E tier, and D tier champions all struggle against A tier plus. But typically, any champion in any tier has specific good matchups in any given tier to where they can counter that champion. Ahead of Yone is a mana champion. Mana champions in general mid lane got hit pretty hard here in preseason 11 with the mana items getting gutted, and that is Ryze. He's struggling really hard. He can't really hit his power spikes, and he has a lot of bad matchups with mages that outrange him, things that can all in him, and everything in between. Ahead of Ryze, we have a semi-troll mid lane pick, which is Garen. He plays primarily best against melee mid laners like Yasuo or Irelia. He can go toe-to-toe, has good wave clear, and he can be quite difficult to gank since he has a speed up and massive damage reduction in his kit. Ahead of Garen, we have a little bit more of a supporty champion. She can play well against melee since she has her snare and can play back and heal off of it. In general, though, she's not really worth picking as a mid laner since she does struggle so much against the top tier mid laners. Ahead of Karma is a champion who was S tier in jungle, mid, and bot lane last season, and that is Karthus. Right now, he's struggling really hard after they nerfed his Q. Plus, with the new item changes, he's just not his old self. I wouldn't recommend playing him mid unless you know exactly what you're playing against, and even then, we have better long-range mages on this list. Ahead of Karthus is a champion that came back a little bit from the grave. Believe it or not, he was even worse, which is 𝐒𝐿 with the Mana Moon buffs. He's coming back into the meta a little bit. He has a few good matchups. He can actually crush Yone, Yasuo, and Annie a lot harder than you think, and he has some other solid matchups as well. His main issue is all-in mages at level 6, such as Fizz, and having to deal with massive burst mages like Vegar, or having to deal with champions that outrange him. He's in a very particular spot where he plays best against melee champs. Ahead of 𝐒𝐿, we have another pick that's going to be somewhat controversial because she's a bit of a fan favorite and has a lot of outplay potential, and that is Kiana. She does have some good matchups against higher tiers, but in general, she has a lot of bad matchups to where you don't want to pick her unless you know exactly what you're playing against. She plays particularly well against Anivia, Set, Yone, Ziggs, Zoe, and Yasuo. Zoe being one of the higher tiers that she can actually take down. Other than that, most of her matchups are fairly poor, and she's going to struggle greatly. Next up is another struggling mana mid laner, and that is Kassadin. With the mana nerfs, he's in a very difficult spot where he's having to swap between Liandry's or Luden's Tempest to have a good starting item. The main issue is he falls so far behind in his first 5 levels against the majority of mid laners. It's very difficult for him to find his footing in the mid late game where he truly shines. Until mana items get a proper buff for AP champions, I wouldn't recommend him or Ryze. Ahead of Kassadin is a champion that, unless you're passionate about him, I wouldn't really recommend him, and that is Aurelion Sol. He is in a weak spot as well with a lot of the top tier mid laners. He gets absolutely just all in and crushed. He relies heavily on shoving wave and then leaving. If he's soloing his enemy laner, that typically means they're messing up. He doesn't have much all-in potential early game. It's primarily just shoving and roaming. Ahead of Aurelion Sol, we have Yasuo 1. Yasuo 1 is doing better than Yasuo 2 right now. Yasuo 2 has much worse matchups. Yasuo doesn't suffer from that to the same degree. All jokes aside, with the Infinity Edge nerfs, Yasuo and Yone are both suffering greatly, where they really struggle to find that mid-game power spike, and their first item can't really match tanks or mages. Ahead of Yasuo is a semi-niche champion who actually has a lot of fantastic matchups with absurdly high win rates, and that is Zilean. Just like with most low tiers on this list, Zilean does struggle with the A tier and S tier champions coming up. However, he has some absolutely fantastic matchups against champions like Yasuo, Orianna, Vladimir, Victor, Zoe, and even Lux. His main issue is kind of B tier, A tier, and S tier. It's just such hard matchups. So he's another niche pick to where as long as you know what you're playing against, you can pick him and get super high value. Ahead of Zilean, we have a little guy who's been struggling lately, which is Vegar. He's normally more of a mid-tier, mid-lane pick, and you'd think he'd be really good with champions like Kassadin being weak. However, once again, the top 3 mid-lane champions are fairly oppressive with all-in damage and CC. Plus, there are plenty of mid-tiers who have really heavy all-ins early like Leblanc, who can shut him down super fast. If you're left alone and you get to farm or you even pick up a kill in lane, yes, you can still hyper carry. Ahead of Vegar is a champion who arguably scales better since he outranges him, and that is Ziggs. Ziggs has a lot of weird matchups. He suffers typically from the same matchups that Vegar does. Anything that can all in him, especially before level 6, or anything that can put too much pressure on him early and shove him off the waves can be highly problematic. Next up, we have a champion that was really strong last season. However, this season, not doing too hot. Nocturne is a lethality mid laner. He can burst down a lot of squishy mid laners, particularly once he's level 6, or if they're melee, he can take some really sharp trades with them. One of his biggest struggles right now is Zhonya's Hourglass is only 2,500 gold, which allows mages to rush at first or second item for super cheap, and once they have that, the game is basically over for him. He can no longer one-shot them. They can put a lot of pressure on him, but he'll never have that all-in pressure. Ahead of Nocturne is a one-trick champion. Wouldn't recommend him in general since he's kind of finicky and he's not typically meta because of the pro scene, and that is Azir. I would just generally try to stay away from him unless you were super passionate about him. He does have a lot of outplay potential, but once again, super finicky. Ahead of him is another mana champion who's struggling, but doing a little bit better than Ryze and Kassadin, and that is Anivia. Same issue, wouldn't touch her until she gets buffs either directly or to mana items. Ahead of her is a booster champion favorite, which is Lissandra. She has a lot of point and click in her kit. Once she stuns you with her R, she just presses her buttons. She shines exceptionally well against melee champions like Yasuo or Orianna, can lock them down instantly and pretty much one-shot them. In team fights, 5v5s, as long as you're not the first one to die, she is extremely dangerous because of her passive. Whenever you get a kill or assist, they turn into this essential frozen bomb, which then blows up and can trigger more of her passives. Ahead of her, we have Lux, super niche. Definitely wouldn't pick her unless you know what you're playing against. She can get forced down hard by all-in champions like LeBlanc or Fizz. Ahead of Lux is a stronger, more versatile version of Lux, and that is Nico. Nico's autos hit a hell of a lot harder, which is great. She can pressure down melee champions harder because of that. She can pressure them with autos, and then when they go to retaliate, she can peg them with abilities. Lux, on the other hand, when she goes to pressure people with her autos, it doesn't do near as much, so she can't always entice the enemies to retaliate. Both of them do exceptionally well against melee champions. That's typically how they land their abilities. Ahead of them, we have a little bit of a troll pick, and that is Fiora. She does exceptionally well against melee champs. She can play against ranged champs as well, though. One nice thing about the Fiora pick mid is people don't usually expect it. So if you're a mid lane and you first pick Fiora, they're not necessarily going to try to counter you. Moving up to D tier, we have a long lost relic of the past who used to be an S plus mid laner back in earlier seasons, and that is Riven. I think she has a lot of potential mid lane. From what I've seen, things like Eclipse and Ravenous Hydra do extremely well on her. If she rushes down Ravenous Hydra, she can push out most mid laners, and she has too much sustain with her shield in the Ravenous Hydra to be pushed out. On top of that, with Eclipse, any squishy mid laner who's not rushing an HP or an armor item, she can pretty much one shot. The Riven pick is similar to Fiora. If you play her mid, no one will really expect it, and they won't try to counterpick you. Ahead of her is a champion that shuts down a lot of melee champions or anything that she has more range than in general, and that is Syndra. She can cast all of her abilities while she is moving. It makes her a massive threat, and she has a decent amount of range in AoE to where if you have less range than her, if you do not have a consistent way of getting to her, she will bully you down and torture you. Ahead of her, we have another control mage, and that is Orianna. They both suffer from the same problem, which is some of the hyper meta mid laners right now easily crush them with all-ins to where they don't have much space to control because they can't counteract the all-in. Ahead of them, we have Renekton. He's a solid bruiser to play in the mid lane. Very similar argument as the Fiora and Riven. Ahead of Renekton, we have an AP assassin bruiser, Diana. She's struggling a bit. She doesn't have the range as many mid laners, and her scalability is weak. If she's going to be as weak as she is in the early game pre-6, she's going to need a banger late game. Right now, all parts of her game are very average, if not below average. In front of her, we have 𝐒𝐿. Absolute monster for getting to champions who don't want to be gotten to. Absolute turret diving monster. Particularly good in mid lane against melee champions, but when played correctly, he can take on pretty much any matchup. Ahead of him is another one-trick champion, which is Rumble. Lots of wave shove. Just be prepared to start roaming out of lane, because once you have the enemies under their turret, you have relatively short range to where it's hard to hurt them, them without getting blasted by the turret. Ahead of Rumble is yet another one-trick champion, and it is Kennen. He has some exceptional matchups against some top tier mid laners, especially the melee ones. He can stun them out and shut them down. Things like 𝐒𝐿𝐂𝐈 and Talon, he absolutely melts and wrecks in 1v1s. Even if they go invisible, he's blasting them with all of his abilities and they can't really get away from it. Because of that reason, we're going to put him in D tier. Do keep in mind that anything outranges Kennen is a really bad matchup for Kennen. It's really only if he has more range than them, particularly against melee assassins mid. Ahead of Kennen, we have a scripting favorite champion, and that is Xerath. Even if you're not scripting, he's a huge threat. If you're timing your abilities properly, especially if your team has CC, his damage is off the charts. He's a great champion to one trick. With that being said, with the current top tier mid laners right now, he has a lot of issues. Ahead of him, we have essentially an AD Xerath, and that's Jace. Lots of poke, lots of long range skill shots. Overall, he's solid. He plays well into pretty much every matchup. His main issue is that he falls off, and if you don't build up a lead early game, you're just watching the game slip out of your fingers. Ahead of him is a champion that's pretty much S tier in the bot lane, and that is Swain. With how cheap Hourglass is right now, it puts Swain in a great position with any mid laner that would want to all in and one-shot him. They don't have that option since he'll be healing off of his R while in Hourglass. So as you can imagine, most champions that are melee or assassins like Kiana or 𝐒𝐿𝐂𝐈 or Yasuo are going to get absolutely crushed by him, and even 𝐒𝐿𝐂𝐈, since he can destroy her with all of his abilities even when she's invisible. Next up, we have Twisted Fate. He's only good if you know how to macro. You're very rarely, if ever, going to kill the enemy laner since his all-in damage and burst is relatively low. He's just good for kind of pushing wave, roaming around the map, similar to Aurelion Sol. Ahead of him is a mid laner that absolutely decimates anything that is melee and can go toe-to-toe with anything that it has equal or more range than, and that is Cho'gath. Against any melee mid laner right now, they cannot match his E auto attack damage, and on top of that, things that have the same range or less, every time you go to trade with him, Cho'gath can hit you with a W for free and then heal his HP and mana off of minions, which gives him amazing matchups against things like Yone, Yasuo, or even Malphite mid. Whenever Malphite goes to hit Cho'gath with a Q, Cho'gath can retaliate with a W. Cho'gath also plays against a few mobile mages quite well, such as Leblanc and Echo, primarily since they are highly reliant on their abilities to stay alive, and his silence lasts for 2 seconds. Very interesting pick since he has such good matchups against most of the C tiers and B tiers. Ahead of Cho'gath, we have Sett. Sett shines in the same way that Fiora and Renekton does, just a little bit cleaner. Against melee champions like Yasuo and Yone, he can perform quite well, and he does rely somewhat on roaming around the map. Rarely can he actually solo kill people mid lane. It's primarily just having mid prio, doing well in 2v2s, and playing well into the mid game. Do keep in mind, late game you'll fall off substantially, but if you're looking for a one-trick champion who can play 4 out of 5 roles, Sett is that champion. Ahead of Sett, we have Vladimir. He's slipped quite a bit since the previous season. He's definitely struggling against the top tiers. Against most of the low tiers though, he has solid matchups. In front of Vladimir, we have an ultimate noob stomper typically played by Smurfs or in hyper high elo, and that is Lucian. Anyone who he outranges, if the Lucian has a good computer and is good on Lucian, he has so much outplay potential with his dash, his auto attack resetters, his double autos on his passive, to where he's just a massive bully. If you are going to play Lucian, you're most likely going to get camped since you're going to have to be playing aggressive. If you're not willing to play aggressive on him, it's kind of like picking Graves jungle and playing safe. You're just not giving your team any true value. If you're going to play Lucian, you got to be walking the tightrope and you're kind of playing along danger. So you got to keep looking at the minimap constantly. Ahead of Lucian, we have Pantheon. Super underrated in the mid lane. He's solid at top. He's an S tier support, and he is a solid mid laner as well. He has a great gap closer to get to champions who outrange him, and with him having a jump, he can dodge especially important abilities like a Cho'gath knockup or anything like that. He also has really solid roam potential. Ahead of Pantheon is a champion that can raid boss down team fights pretty hard. That is Aatrox. He's a bit of a niche mid laner, and you definitely don't want to pick him if the enemy mid laner has a dash in their kit. They can consistently dodge your Qs. That's going to be a massive issue. But if they don't have a dash and you know you can get to them, he's a solid pick for just shoving waves. He can even force kills in lane, and he scales pretty well up until everyone has 4 to 6 items. Ahead of Aatrox, we have Ahri. Still super strong, super slippery. Doesn't have many bad matchups since she's fairly long ranged and is slippery, has magic damage and true damage. Overall, a great one-trick champion. Ahead of her, we have Vel'Koz. A lot of you are probably going to think it's weird we're putting him this high up in the list. However, he actually has a lot of good matchups. Anything that can force an all-in on him that he can't really stop, like a Fizz or Leblanc, is going to be highly problematic. But he outranges most champions on this list. Things like Karthus, 𝐒𝐿𝐄, Ryze, Anivia, Azir for the most part, Lux. He just straight up outranges to where if Vel'Koz decides he doesn't want to fight, he doesn't have to. The only way he has to fight is if you can actually force an all-in with OP dashes. Plus, you can play Vel'Koz as support, so whenever you do play in mid, they're not going to counterpick you most of the time. Ahead of him, we have Talon, super strong, great one-trick champion. He can only really play mid lane right now, which is unfortunate. Whenever you pick him, the enemy has a decent opportunity to counterpick you. With that being said, Duskblade, really OP if you're smurfing or it's an easy matchup, or you could just go for Eclipse, which is great for trades and just scaling in general. Ahead of him, we have Cassiopeia, solid mid lane pick since she's also highly played bot lane, particularly in high elo. They don't necessarily know where you're going to go. You could even play her top lane if you really wanted to. You just have to avoid that if they have a tank top laner like Maokai. Ahead of her, we have super easy point and click, highly recommend him. That is Malzahar. He's just a really solid all-around mid laner. He has a lot of control. He's one of the best control mages, honestly. He's a lot better than Syndra and Orianna since his R just gives so much more impact than any single one of their abilities. Orianna R can give more impact, but with some of the higher tiers here, you're going to see that they're melee, which he does exceptionally well with his R. Since you can't flash out of it, you actually have to have QSS, which is inconvenient if not impossible to build for mage champions. Ahead of Malzahar, we have Leblanc. She shuts down really anything that doesn't want to be touched. A lot of things that we discussed that just want to sit back, like Vel'Koz or Karthus or even Anivia or Azir. If she's good and willing to play aggressive, there's not much they can do to counteract that. They're going to need some jungle help. Ahead of her is a champion who's been highly problematic in the top lane and can play it quite well, but is also a solid mid laner, and that's Kale. She really wants to just sit back and farm for a while. She's good against melee champions. Against ranged champions, she has some issues, particularly if they outrange her. Things like Vel'Koz can be really, really bad. Way outranges her. There are champions on here that she can play against and just try to scale up and stay alive. Katarina's new items are kind of weird. She normally rushes Blade of the Rune King, so she's kind of more auto attack based. Other than that though, she's still a solid champion and great for smurfing. You do need to be careful who you're playing against because she does have a lot of bad matchups. Anything that can point and click on her is gonna absolutely annihilate her. You're primarily gonna be picking her against skill shot mages, things like the Vegar or Xerath, where you can instantly dodge their abilities and they don't have much counterplay. Anything that can click on your head like a Pantheon or a Cho'gath is going to be an issue. Ahead of Katarina, we have a great support champion who is also starting to work her way into the mid lane because of the prevalent mages in the top tier, and that is Morgana. Once again, she's here because of the top tier champions, not necessarily because of the AD lower tier champions. She has plenty of bad matchups versus physical champions like Tristana, Jace, Pyke. In general though, she plays pretty well against mages because of her black shield. If they do hyper outrange her, it can be an issue. As long as she has more range than the mages, she plays quite well, and she does play quite well against the upcoming champions. Ahead of Morgana, we have Zoe. All around, really solid mid to long range champion, and who knows, maybe you'll pick up 4 redemptions in a row, which will make it impossible for you to lose lane phase. Because of that reason, she kind of makes me sick, but hey, she's been good ever since her release, and she's going to keep staying good because she just has so much in her kit. Ahead of her is Silas. I like him. You can play him as a jungle potentially. He's not good at it, but he's also a good top laner. As a mid laner, he's not a blind pickable. There are things that will give him issues, particularly if he can't get to them, or even if he does, it doesn't matter. If he's playing against consistent damage champions that can rail him after his burst, things like Jace, Kale, Brand, Cassiopeia, Malzahar, Annie, even Nico, that can be really bad for him. He's primarily just trying to steal ultimates, and that's where all of his strength is going to come from. He can play well against bursty melee champions quite well, things like Pyke or Yasuo or Kiana, but if he's having to use his abilities to get to them, especially if they're full HP, he can't really one-shot them. So by the time he forces an engage on someone like Cassiopeia, it's really going to hurt him. Because of that reason, he is high tier, but you don't want to pick him if you don't know what you're playing against, and if you do pick him, you may not want to ban a mid lane champion because then they're going to assume you're not top and that you're actually going mid. Ahead of him is Malphite. Malphite plays well into every single AD matchup on this list, whether it's Garen, Yasuo, Yone. He plays really well. He can rush into Sunfire Aegis, or he can go more AP. If he's playing against a mage, he typically goes more down the AP route, but against melees, heck, he can just build tank and still one-shot them anyways. Ahead of him, we have Annie. She's fantastically strong right now. Lots of damage, lots of burst. With her shield and speed up, she has super good trades in lane and absolutely murders melee champions. Yasuo and Yone don't have a prayer against a solid Annie player. It's just guaranteed one. Her biggest issue is mages that outrange her that she cannot get to. Believe it or not, Corki is actually one of Annie's hardest counters in the game, and this is something I talked about at the beginning of the video. Just because something's low tier doesn't mean it doesn't have specifically good matchups against higher tier champions. Xerath, Set, and Garen are also great champions against her, and Garen's really low down here, and so is the Set. So you do need to be mindful of who you play her against, but in general, she can play against most things on this list and go neutral if not have an advantage. She's a great beginner champion for sure. Ahead of Annie is a champion you really shouldn't be playing unless you're at least plat. That is 𝐒𝐿𝐂𝐈. She's one of the worst late game champions in the game, but if you were playing her correctly early game against a champion you can abuse because they cannot hurt you when you're invisible, unlike something like Swain or a Kennen, then you're gonna shine. She can do lots of turret dives. She's super fast where she can get out. She plays well with jungle pressure, but once again, if you're lower than plat, I wouldn't recommend the champion. Ahead of her, we have Zed. He's one of the few AD assassins who is high up on this list. The reason being, mage items play really strong on mages mid. Yes, lethality is really good for junglers right now. Things like 𝐒𝐿𝐿𝐾 and Graves are shining, but the mage mid items, particularly because of Hourglass, is giving most physical damage champions or lethality champions like Nocturne a lot of issues, because Zhonya's Hourglass is only 2500. Ahead of Zed, we have Victor, super strong. You can even play him top lane. He plays really well against anything he outranges since he has a speed up and a shield. He can take really good trades. Overall, great champion, not many weaknesses. Now, in the A tier, we have Galio. Super oppressive. As you may have noticed, mages are filling up most of the high tiers. Any mage, since he has a magic shield, he plays really well against. So mages in general aren't good against him. Even if they outrange him, if he just waits for a gank, you can be in a lot of trouble. Ahead of Galio is another mage, Echo. Pretty much impossible for any assassin to kill once he's level 6, and then eventually he's going to get Hourglass as well. Super oppressive, super annoying champion. And then at the very top, we have Nunu. No, I'm just kidding. We don't have Nunu. At the very top, we have Fizz. Fizz is incredibly powerful. He is the better version of Leblanc right now. Any champion that does not want to be touched, levels 1 through 5, he will destroy, especially if he hits level 6 first. Anything on here, he'll basically one-shot. Whether it's a Zoe, Silas, because bear in mind, Fizz takes Ignite as well, so he's cutting your healing, and he has built-in healing cut anyways. Really, anything that's squishy and can't dodge his R is just instantly going to die the moment he hits 6. The only things that can kind of play into Fizz is weird stuff like Garen, since he has massive damage reduction, to where even if Fizz lands his R, if Garen times his damage reduction properly, he doesn't have a chance. One of Fizz's biggest issues in the previous seasons was champions like Kassadin, but with how weak Kassadin is right now with his item options, Fizz isn't even that bad against him. So right now, we don't have many proper counters to him. Even his bad matchups are only slightly weighted against him, to where he is the only S tier mid laner right now. I kept these goofballs around to keep you guys guessing, and we're gonna put them here. We're gonna put Pyke C tier. He is essentially a Katarina who is AD. He's a little more finicky to play, I think. I don't want to say he takes more skill, but there are less Pyke mid players than Katarina players, but super high carry potential. Just look at Davemon, super cool guy. Next up, we have Nunu. Nunu mid, still incredibly powerful, dumps on melee champions, even against ranged champions if they don't have consistent damage. You can just press Q and heal up. He has fantastic roams, better than Aurelion Sol right now. Especially if his jungler is doing well, he can speed up off the scuttles. Absolutely disgusting. The next one is going to be semi-controversial, and that is Tristana. I think it would be very unfair to put her any lower than C tier, and if I had my way, I'd be putting her in B tier as well, but that's going to rustle too many feathers. So we're going to go ahead and stick her behind Pyke. In my opinion, she plays very similar to Pyke. She is a ranged Pyke, lots of all-in options. Generally, will be sitting back and chilling until the time is right. But once the time is right, her all-in is super scary. She scales really well, and it's just an absolutely fantastic champion for solo queue. If you get good at timing her Ws, you can dodge virtually every ability in the game. For example, Twisted Fate stun cards won't matter. Even Victor stun won't matter if you're timing it right. It's a little bit tricky on Victor's stun. Every CC doesn't matter if you time her and jump correctly. Now, if there's too many CCs coming at you at once, you obviously can't dodge them all. It's only at the start of her jump, but absolutely fantastic champion. Recommend looking into her. For Brand, I personally think he's a better jungler than he is as a mid laner for the most part. Against melee champions though, he's not that bad, and recently he became a better mid laner, putting him in D tier because of his R splashing damage. It's actually quite nice. If something melee jumps on his head like Katarina, he can just press R and then Hourglass, and they're screwed because Brand's R bounces off of himself now. So even if there aren't any nearby enemy minions, his 1v1s against champions that have to stand close to him are quite strong. Against things that outrange him, like the Syndra, Vel'Koz, Lux, those aren't going to be good matchups, but if you have more range, hey, it's a decent choice. That is going to wrap up this mid lane tier list for patch 10.24 for the strongest mid laners to carry solo queue with. If you guys enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you think down in the comments below. If you haven't had a chance yet, come chat and chill live on stream. My name is KingStix. Thank you for watching. I'll catch you guys next time.